What would you do if, thousands of feet above the ground, the simple act of holding your phone turned into a public trial of your dignity? On Flight 2187, a teenage boy quietly jotting down notes found himself accused, humiliated, and stripped of the basic respect every person deserves. A flight attendant's decision, a father's calm yet unyielding defense, and the silent witnesses around them set off a chain of events no one on board could have predicted. Was it just a misunderstanding, or something deeper? Why do moments like this, born from prejudice and power imbalance, echo so strongly in the hearts of those who witness them, and how can compassion emerge, even when anger feels justified? This isn't just the story of a flight. It's the story of identity, resilience, and the power of standing in truth when silence would be easier. It's about the ripple one voice can create when the world tries to shut it down. So, stay with us, because once you hear what happened at 30,000 feet, you'll never look at an ordinary flight the same way again. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss stories that move, challenge, and inspire. The terminal at Nashville International Airport pulsed with the kind of energy only early mornings could bring. Rolling suitcases hummed across polished floors. Overhead speakers called out boarding groups in clipped tones, and the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the faint tang of jet fuel drifted in through the automatic doors. For most travelers, it was another day, another flight. But for Ethan Carter, 17 years old and sharp-eyed, this morning carried the weight of a future not yet written. He walked beside his father, Dr. Samuel Carter, who moved with a calm steadiness that stood in contrast to the restless crowd around them. Samuel had a presence that drew attention quietly, broad-shouldered, deliberate in his steps, his gaze always observant yet kind. Ethan admired that about him. His father never seemed rushed, never flustered, as though the world couldn't disturb the stillness he carried inside. Ethan often wished he could be like that, instead of the bundle of nerves he felt himself to be. Today mattered, more than any other day. This wasn't just a flight to Baltimore. This was the beginning of a journey that would decide if Ethan could follow the path his late mother once dreamed for him. 3 years ago, cancer had taken her. In those final months, she had told him, over and over, to pursue knowledge, to let his mind heal others even if she could not be saved. He carried that voice with him everywhere, etched into the notes he wrote in the margins of textbooks, whispered in the quiet hours before sleep. And now, Baltimore. A scholarship interview at a prestigious medical research institute, a chance to prove that his work, his mother's dream, deserved a place in the world. Ethan adjusted the strap of his backpack nervously. He could feel his phone buzzing slightly against his chest, where he had tucked it into his jacket pocket. The draft of an idea still open on the screen. He had been writing notes about a potential therapy model, something he'd been piecing together late last night. Even in the rush of airports, he didn't want to lose it. The thought lingered, tugging at him finish it, before the words slip away. "Breathe, son," Samuel said softly, noticing the tightness in Ethan's shoulders. His father didn't need to ask what was running through his mind. He had that gift, the ability to read silence, to sense the storm beneath someone's composure. Ethan forced a small smile. "I'm fine. Just don't want to mess this up." "You won't." Samuel's voice was calm, steady, the kind of reassurance that felt like a hand on the back guiding you forward. "Remember, this isn't about perfection. It's about showing them who you are. That's enough. Who I am, Ethan thought. But what if who I am isn't enough? He didn't say it out loud. Instead, he nodded, swallowing the doubt that rose like bile in his throat. They reached their gate. Group numbers flashed on the screen, and the boarding line snaked forward in fits and starts. Ethan's gaze drifted to the windows, where planes taxied slowly into place, their engines roaring like caged beasts. He loved planes as a kid, used to press his face against the glass and marvel at their size. Now, he only saw the confinement inside, the hours of sitting still with his thoughts gnawing at him. Baltimore, here we come, Samuel murmured, almost to himself. They scanned their passes and stepped down the jet bridge. The hum of the air conditioning grew louder, and soon the narrow cabin opened before them. Rows of seats stretched in both directions. Overhead, bins snapping shut, passengers settling in with the resigned sighs of travelers bracing for hours in the air. Ethan slid into the window seat, his father taking the aisle. He placed his backpack beneath the seat, his heart beating faster now that they were closer to departure. Out the small oval window, he could see ground crew guiding luggage carts, their neon vests glowing against the gray tarmac. He pulled out his phone. Just a few lines, he told himself, just a few more sentences before takeoff. His thumbs hovered over the keyboard, his mind spinning through the half-formed idea, a method of combining neurostimulation with targeted therapy for degenerative conditions. His pulse quickened as the sentences poured out. Each word felt like a thread tying him back to his mother, weaving her unfinished hopes into something tangible. But then he hesitated. Should he really be doing this now? The announcements had been clear, all devices off for departure. He knew the rule. He also knew how fragile ideas could be, how quickly they evaporated if not captured. His chest tightened with indecision. Samuel was busy stowing his coat and didn't notice. Ethan tapped quickly, whispering under his breath as though saying the words aloud would hold them steady. He knew he had maybe 1 minute before a flight attendant walked by, maybe less. He needed to finish. Around him, the plane filled with the ordinary sounds of travel children whining about snacks, a businessman tapping his laptop closed, the thump of overhead compartments shutting with finality. It felt like the world narrowing, pressing in, as though every detail sharpened because something important was about to happen. Ethan pressed the final period on his sentence and exhaled. Relief washed over him. He had it captured before it could vanish. He leaned back slightly, phone still in his hand. And that's when he saw her, a flight attendant moving down the aisle, posture rigid, eyes scanning like a hawk. Clara Hayes. He didn't know her name yet, but the set of her jaw, the sharpness of her gaze, made his stomach twist instantly. She was heading his way, and she had already noticed the glow of his phone screen. Ethan's fingers tightened around the device. He thought about slipping it away quickly, pretending he hadn't been using it. But something in him resisted. Why should he hide? He wasn't playing a game or scrolling pointlessly. He was working. He was preserving something that mattered. Still, the rules were the rules. His heart thudded louder. He glanced at his father, who hadn't noticed yet, lost in buckling his seatbelt. Ethan wondered, should I put it away? Should I fight for this? The question hung in the air, heavy, as Clara stepped closer. And so began the flight that would test more than just airline rules. The cabin air was cooler than Ethan expected, carrying the faint scent of recirculated coffee and disinfectant. As he shifted in his seat, he noticed how every row seemed to hold its own little world. families negotiating seat swaps, business travelers checking emails, children clutching stuffed animals that looked as though they'd traveled more miles than most adults. It struck Ethan that an airplane was like a floating microcosm of humanity, people from different lives, pressed together in one narrow tube, forced to share hours of closeness they would never have chosen otherwise. Directly across the aisle, a woman in her 70s was carefully tucking a scarf around her neck. Her hair was silver, swept neatly back, and her eyes carried a brightness that seemed out of place amid the general weariness of boarding passengers. She gave Ethan a quick smile, one of those kind, unassuming gestures that made him sit up a little straighter. Later, he would learn her name, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks. At that moment, though, she was simply the friendly stranger who noticed when he caught her gaze. A few rows ahead, a group of college students laughed too loudly, passing a bag of chips back and forth, ignoring the way their knees pressed against the seats in front of them. A businessman, diagonally across, typed furiously on his laptop, muttering under his breath about deadlines. The symphony of small noises blended into a hum that seemed both ordinary and foreboding. Ethan tried to steady his breathing, telling himself that once they were in the air, he could focus on his notes again, away from the bustle. And then he noticed her, the flight attendant, the same woman whose gaze had locked onto him moments before. Clara Hayes. She was moving deliberately down the aisle now, checking overhead bins, adjusting straps, occasionally leaning down to bark reminders about seat belts. Her voice carried that practiced tone of someone who had repeated the same lines for decades. But it wasn't just repetition that made her voice sharp. It was something deeper. Ethan studied her discreetly. She was older than most of the other crew members. Her uniform pressed so neatly, it looked almost rigid. The lines around her mouth weren't just from age but from years of frowning. Years of holding herself like armor. She wasn't warm like some of the attendants Ethan had seen before, the ones who smiled at children and offered extra peanuts with a wink. Clara's smile, when it appeared at all, was thin and fleeting. He wondered what her life had been like. Did she enjoy this job once, decades ago, when flying felt like freedom rather than fatigue? Or had she always carried that bitterness in her eyes Ethan didn't know? But he felt it, a presence heavy enough to make him tuck his phone closer to his chest. Clara paused to help a passenger stow a bag, muttering about people bringing half their houses onto the plane. Her words weren't meant to be heard, but Ethan caught them anyway. He glanced at his father. Samuel noticed, too, though he said nothing. He rarely spoke without purpose. As Clara reached the row ahead of them, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Richard Evans. We'll be departing shortly for Baltimore, with an estimated flight time of 1 hour and 45 minutes. Weather is clear. A little turbulence expected as we pass over the Appalachians, but nothing out of the ordinary. Please take your seats and fasten your belts." The voice carried authority, but not harshness. Ethan pictured the man behind it, Richard Evans sitting in the cockpit, headset snug, hands steady on the controls. Samuel had told Ethan once that pilots, like surgeons, had to carry both precision and calm. Ethan believed it now, hearing that measured tone. As the announcement ended, Clara picked up her pace. She stopped briefly to check on a child fidgeting with the tray table. She didn't smile, but her hands were surprisingly gentle as she lifted the latch and secured it. Then her eyes cut back toward Ethan. He stiffened. She had seen his phone earlier. He could feel it, to distract himself. He leaned slightly toward his father. "Do you think it'll be bad turbulence?" Samuel shook his head lightly. "Probably not. Captains don't usually mention it unless they expect more than a few bumps. Just stay calm." Calm. The word felt slippery in Ethan's chest. Across the aisle, Mrs. Brooks leaned forward, speaking to the man beside her. Her voice carried over just enough for Ethan to catch. "Flying always reminds me of how little control we truly have. Up here, you have to trust strangers completely. The pilot, the crew, even the passengers around you." The man grunted noncommittally, but her words sank into Ethan's ears. Trust. Control. Two things he felt slipping through his fingers lately. Clara reappeared suddenly at their row. She glanced at Samuel, gave the standard reminder about belts, then let her gaze settle firmly on Ethan. Her lips pressed together, her eyes narrowing at the faint glow from his phone screen. "Phone's off," she said curtly. "Now." Ethan froze. His instinct screamed to obey, to slip the phone away immediately and avoid confrontation. But the thought of losing that sentence he had been crafting earlier gnawed at him. If he put it down now, would the idea evaporate? He opened his mouth, then shut it again. His heart thudded in his throat. Clara tilted her head, expectant, her patience visibly thinning. Samuel glanced between them, reading the tension instantly. His brows drew together, though he didn't speak yet. Ethan knew that look. His father was measuring the situation, weighing whether to intervene. The cabin around them continued its low murmur, seatbelts clicking, children whining, a flight attendant at the back announcing the overhead compartments were full. But to Ethan, the world had narrowed to the few feet between himself and Clara. "Just 30 seconds, Ethan said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "Please, I just need to finish this one note." Clara blinked at him, as though she hadn't expected resistance. Her expression hardened. "I said now. Rules aren't suggestions." Ethan's throat tightened. He could feel Mrs. Brooks's eyes on him from across the aisle, could feel his father's presence beside him. Calm but alert. It wasn't just about the phone anymore. It was about something larger, though he couldn't yet name it. Something that made his stomach knot and his palms sweat. Clara leaned down slightly, her tone cutting. "Don't make me ask again." In that moment, Ethan realized this flight wasn't going to be ordinary. Not for him, not for anyone sitting within earshot. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear, a small spark of defiance flickered. The engines rumbled beneath the cabin, a low growl vibrating through the floor as the aircraft prepared for taxi. Passengers shifted in their seats, tugging on seat belts, adjusting pillows, settling into the enforced stillness of takeoff. Yet, in row 17, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Ethan's pulse hammered against his ribs. Clara Hayes loomed over him, her shadow cutting across his lap. The glow of his phone screen reflected faintly in her eyes, and her lips were set into a hard line that left no room for compromise. Around them, the murmur of passengers faded into an expectant hush, the way people instinctively quiet when sensing conflict close by. "Phone's off," Clara repeated, sharper this time. Her voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed without hesitation. Ethan felt heat rising up his neck. He could hear his father's breathing beside him, steady and controlled, a stark contrast to the storm in his chest. Samuel Carter had faced operating rooms filled with chaos, but here He waited, watching, choosing silence for now. "I just need a few more seconds," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice even. He hated the way it wavered slightly, betraying the tension coiling inside him. "It's important. Please." Clara's brows arched, disbelief flashing across her face as though his words were an insult to her authority. She leaned closer, lowering her voice but sharpening it into a blade. "This is not a debate. Turn it off. Now." Her hand moved suddenly, swift as a striking hawk. She snatched the phone from his grasp, the motion so quick Ethan barely processed it before hearing the sharp crack of plastic against the floor. Gasps rose from nearby passengers. The phone skidded under the seat in front of him, screen flashing once before going dark. Ethan froze, his chest constricted, as though the air had been sucked from the cabin. That phone wasn't just a device. It held months of his research notes, fragments of his mother's dream, thoughts he hadn't shared with anyone yet. Seeing it on the floor, discarded like trash, hit him harder than he expected. Shame surged first hot, humiliating, then anger, bright and raw. Across the aisle, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks clutched her scarf tighter, eyes narrowing as she witnessed every movement. She wasn't the kind of woman to ignore injustice, and Ethan could feel her silent disapproval radiating toward Clara. Other passengers exchanged murmurs, heads turning, curiosity mingling with discomfort. Samuel Carter's chair creaked as he shifted, slowly, deliberately. He unbuckled his belt and stood. His height gave him a quiet authority. Though he didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. "That's enough," he said, calm but firm, the kind of tone that didn't shout but carried like thunder anyway. Clara straightened, crossing her arms defensively. "Your son was disobeying regulations. Federal rules require all electronic devices to be powered down during taxi. This isn't optional." Samuel's eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. "What's not optional is basic respect. You don't snatch property out of a passenger's hand, especially a minor." Ethan stared up at his father, a mixture of relief and awe surging through him. He had grown up watching Samuel handle conflicts with surgical precision, always calm, always measured, but never backing down from what mattered. Clara's jaw tightened. Respect goes both ways. He ignored a direct instruction. Samuel leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping just enough to draw the attention of everyone within 3 rows. He asked for 30 seconds. Not to break the rules, but to preserve something important. That did not warrant aggression. Ethan swallowed hard, torn between the desire to shrink back into invisibility and the urge to shout his own defense. His fingers twitched against his thighs, wanting to retrieve the phone from the floor but afraid it would reignite the fire. The aircraft jolted slightly as it began to roll, the cabin lights flickering, yet no one seemed focused on the movement of the plane anymore. All eyes were drawn to the standoff in row 17. Clara's face reddened, her authority suddenly under scrutiny. She glanced toward the front of the cabin, as though seeking backup, but no crew member approached. Passengers waited, silent witnesses to the clash unfolding before them. Finally, she snapped, "Rules keep people safe. If I allowed every passenger to delay compliance for their own reasons, chaos would follow." Samuel's response was measured, deliberate, and if rules are enforced without humanity, then they fail their purpose. Safety without dignity is not safety. It's control. The words landed heavy. Ethan felt them vibrate inside him, filling the hollow space where shame had sat moments earlier. He looked at his father and saw not just the man who had raised him, but a defender, a shield. Mrs. Brooks cleared her throat loudly across the aisle. Her voice, though elderly, carried surprising strength. I saw what happened. The boy wasn't disruptive. He was respectful. That was unnecessary. Clara stiffened, but before she could reply, another voice chimed in, a young man 2 rows back. "Yeah, I saw it too." She slapped the phone right out of his hand. Murmurs spread like wildfire through the cabin, passengers emboldened to speak. Clara's eyes darted nervously, sensing the tide turning. Still, she clung to her role, her authority. I was ensuring compliance. That's my duty. Samuel's tone softened slightly, though it lost none of its gravity. Your duty is also to protect the dignity of the people entrusted to your care. That includes my son. The engines roared louder, preparing for takeoff. But in that moment, the plane might as well have been standing still. The true turbulence was inside the cabin, pulsing between the rows. Ethan bent forward, finally retrieving his phone from the floor. He cradled it carefully, his thumb brushing the screen. The crack along the corner felt like a wound, but the device still lit up, mercifully intact. He exhaled shakily, relief mixing with bitterness. Clara opened her mouth, but before she could respond, the intercom crackled again. "Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff," Captain Richard Evans announced, his voice calm as ever. The timing carried an unspoken reminder the flight must continue. Clara stepped back stiffly, her lips pressed tight. "We'll discuss this later," she muttered, before turning to continue her checks down the aisle. Samuel sat again, his expression composed, though his eyes carried a quiet fire. He glanced at Ethan. "Are you all right?" Ethan nodded slowly, though his throat ached with unspoken words. All right wasn't the right word. He felt rattled, humiliated, but also strangely emboldened. Something inside him had shifted. He had seen his father stand against injustice without anger, without losing control. He wanted to carry that same strength someday. As the plane lifted from the runway, engines screaming, Ethan pressed his forehead against the window. The city below shrank quickly, lights fading into a patchwork of gray clouds. He should have been thinking about the scholarship interview, about the opportunities waiting in Baltimore. Instead, his mind burned with the image of Clara's hand snatching his phone, the sound of it hitting the floor, the ripple of murmurs from the passengers. He closed his eyes, gripping the cracked phone tighter. This wasn't just about notes anymore. It was about something larger, about dignity, about justice, about the line between rules and respect. And he knew, deep in his chest, this confrontation was far from over. The cabin settled into uneasy silence as the plane climbed higher, but beneath the hum of the engines, the tension lingered, like static, waiting for the next strike. The plane leveled off above the clouds, the world below swallowed by an endless expanse of white. Sunlight streamed through the oval windows, casting slanted beams across the cabin. From a distance, it might have seemed peaceful, but in row 17 the calm was fragile, stretched thin like glass about to crack. Ethan sat rigid, clutching his phone as though it were a lifeline. His heart still raced from the altercation minutes earlier, replaying Clara's hand snatching the device, the sting of humiliation, the murmurs of the passengers. He tried to breathe deeply, to follow his father's example of composure, but his chest felt tight. Every time he closed his eyes, He saw his mother's face, imagined her disappointment if he let himself shrink in silence. Samuel Carter, however, showed no sign of shrinking. He sat upright in his seat, broad shoulders filling the aisle, his presence radiating a calm authority that felt both grounding and unyielding. He hadn't raised his voice, not once, yet the words he had spoken to Clara still echoed in the air. Safety without dignity is not safety. Ethan could almost feel the passengers still chewing on that phrase, their glances betraying their thoughts. Clara returned a few minutes later, her tray tucked against her hip as she offered drinks down the aisle. Her smile for other passengers was tight, almost forced, but when her eyes landed on row 17, the warmth vanished completely. She didn't stop, not yet, but Ethan could feel the tension coil tighter with each step closer she came. Mrs. Brooks leaned slightly across the aisle, her scarf brushing her chin. "Don't let it eat at you," she whispered, her voice low enough that only Ethan heard. Some people confuse power with respect, but the truth always shows itself. Ethan gave a small nod. He appreciated her words, though they did little to ease the knot in his stomach. When Clara finally reached their row, she set the tray down on the cart with a deliberate thud. "Something to drink?" she asked the passengers ahead of them. Her voice clipped. Then she turned her gaze on Samuel and Ethan. "We still need to address what happened." Samuel tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Do we?" "Yes," Clara said sharply. "Your son disobeyed crew instructions. That's a safety violation. It can't be ignored." Ethan felt heat creep up his neck again, but before he could speak, his father lifted a hand lightly. It wasn't a silencing gesture, more like a reminder, patience first, then words. Samuel's voice was calm, even, but carried weight like a stone dropped into still water. "My son asked for 30 seconds. Samuel said, that request did not threaten the safety of this aircraft. What did escalate the situation was your decision to forcibly take his phone and toss it to the ground. That was unnecessary, unprofessional, and, frankly, unacceptable." A hush spread around them. Even the college students 2 rows ahead had quieted, their chips forgotten. Clara's jaw worked, her face stiffening. I was enforcing regulations. It's my responsibility to make sure passengers comply. "Compliance," Samuel replied, "isn't achieved by humiliation. It's achieved by clarity and respect. You had both options. You chose neither." Ethan's chest swelled with a mix of pride and awe. His father's words cut through the air like a scalpel, precise and undeniable. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't aggressive, yet somehow the calm made his stance unshakable. Clara bristled, her cheeks flushing. "If you have a complaint, you can take it up with the airline after we land." Samuel leaned slightly forward, his gaze steady. "This is not just about a complaint. This is about how you treat people in your care. Every passenger on this plane deserves to feel safe and respected, especially a young man who has done nothing to provoke hostility. From across the aisle." Mrs. Brooks spoke again, louder this time, her voice clear. "He's right. I saw everything. The boy was polite. He didn't raise his voice. You struck first, not him." Other passengers murmured their agreement. A man in the row behind added, "It wasn't right. I saw it too." Clara's eyes flickered, scanning the faces turned toward her. For a moment, something cracked in her expression. Doubt, perhaps, or the realization that she had lost the invisible shield of authority she normally carried. but just as quickly, she smoothed it over, retreating behind the mask of professionalism. "I'll inform the captain," she said stiffly, before pushing the cart forward. Ethan exhaled, not realizing until then that he had been holding his breath. He turned to his father, voice hushed. "Do you think she'll really tell the captain?" Samuel's lips curved into the faintest smile. "She might, but captains know the difference between rules enforced and power abused. Let's trust he'll see it." Trust. That word again. Ethan turned it over in his mind like a stone in his palm. He wanted to believe it. The seatbelt sign chimed softly above them, signaling the plane had reached cruising altitude. Passengers unbuckled, stretching legs, retrieving books and headphones. Life in the cabin seemed to resume its normal rhythm, but beneath the chatter and movement, the undercurrent of tension still pulsed. Ethan stared at the cracked corner of his phone, fingers tracing the fracture. He thought of his notes, the ideas he had saved, the work tied to his mother's memory. If the device had broken completely, he wasn't sure how he would have handled it. A part of him wanted to confront Clara himself, to demand an apology, to shout that she had no right, but another part of him, the part still learning, still searching, clung to his father's example. Strength could be firm without fury. He leaned back, whispering almost to himself, "I don't want to let her win." Samuel turned, his eyes soft but steady. Winning isn't about shouting louder, Ethan. It's about holding your ground with dignity. That's how you make sure her actions don't define you. The words sank deep, carving themselves into Ethan's thoughts. He nodded slowly, committing them to memory. At the front of the plane, Clara disappeared into the galley. A moment later, the intercom chimed again. Captain Richard Evans' voice filled the cabin, calm and even. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're cruising comfortably at 35,000 feet. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. Our crew will be with you shortly." Ethan glanced at his father. "Do you think he knows already?" Samuel's eyes flicked briefly toward the cockpit door. "Captains usually know everything happening in their cabin. The question is how he'll choose to handle it." Ethan's stomach tightened again. He imagined being summoned to the front, questioned, maybe even accused, but he also imagined the captain siding with them, validating his father's words. The uncertainty gnawed at him. As he sat in silence, Mrs. Brooks leaned across the aisle once more. "Young man," she said softly, her eyes kind but piercing, "don't let fear silence you. Your father is right. Dignity is worth defending." Ethan swallowed hard. He didn't trust his voice enough to answer, but he nodded. The cabin hummed with conversation, with the clinking of cups and the occasional laugh. Yet row 17 remained its own battlefield, marked by the echoes of a clash that was far from finished. And though Ethan didn't know it yet, the next confrontation would reach higher stakes, pulling not only him and Clara, but the entire flight into its orbit. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and constant, a backdrop to the uneasy silence that lingered in row 17. For most passengers, the flight had settled into the familiar rhythm of cruising altitude. Some leaned back with earbuds in, others flipped through magazines or drifted into naps. But for Ethan Carter, every second felt heavy, strung tight with the expectation that something else was coming. He tried to lose himself in the view outside. The clouds below looked like endless fields of white, sculpted into shapes by winds he couldn't see. He imagined walking on them, sinking into their softness, far away from this pressurized metal tube where every glance and every word seemed charged. But no matter how far his mind wandered, the weight of Clara Hayes's gaze kept pulling him back. When she re-emerged from the galley, her stride was purposeful. She didn't push the drink cart this time. Her hands were empty, her shoulders squared, and her eyes locked on row 17 with a resolve that made Ethan's stomach clench. He could sense it. She was not finished. Samuel Carter noticed, too. He straightened in his seat, folding his hands calmly on his lap, as though preparing for an argument he knew was inevitable. His composure had a way of grounding Ethan, but it also made him wonder how could his father be so calm when tension pressed in from every direction. Clara stopped at their row. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Dr. Carter," she said, her voice tight, "the captain would like a word with you, and with your son." Ethan's heart lurched. "With me?" he asked before he could stop himself. Clara's lips thinned. "Yes, both of you." Samuel rose slowly, adjusting his jacket. "Very well," he said evenly, as if being summoned to the cockpit mid-flight were no more troubling than being asked to pass the salt at dinner. He placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Come on, son." Ethan hesitated. He wanted to argue, to insist he hadn't done anything wrong, but the eyes of half the cabin were already on him, and the last thing he wanted was to create more spectacle. Reluctantly, he followed his father down the aisle, the murmurs of passengers buzzing like static in his ears. At the front, Captain Richard Evans stood waiting just outside the cockpit door. He was tall, with silver hair and a presence that carried quiet authority. His expression was neither hostile nor friendly. It was measured, the face of a man accustomed to balancing truth against procedure. "Dr. Carter, Ethan," the captain greeted, his voice steady. "Why don't we step into the galley for a moment?" The small space was cramped, smelling faintly of coffee and metal. Clara lingered near the curtain, arms folded tightly across her chest, while the captain gestured for Samuel and Ethan to stand opposite him. "I've been briefed," Captain Evans began, his eyes flicking briefly toward Clara, "but I want to hear directly from you. What happened back there?" Samuel glanced at Ethan before speaking. "My son was writing something on his phone. When asked to turn it off, he requested 30 seconds. Instead of allowing that small courtesy, Ms. Hayes forcibly removed the phone from his hand and threw it to the floor. That is the entirety of what occurred." Clara's eyes blazed. "That's not accurate. He was refusing to comply with the crew instructions. I acted to ensure safety regulations were followed." Ethan felt his pulse spike, but before he could speak, Samuel lifted a hand slightly, signaling for him to wait. The captain's gaze shifted between them, weighing the words. "Ms. Hayes," Captain Evans said carefully, "did the passenger pose any actual danger to the aircraft or to others?" Clara's mouth opened, then closed. She hesitated, and in that pause, the silence spoke louder than words. "Finally," she said, "potential danger exists any time instructions are ignored." The captain nodded slowly, but his eyes returned to Samuel. "And your son, did he raise his voice, act aggressively, or resist physically?" "No," Samuel said. "He was respectful. He asked for time. That was all." Ethan finally spoke, his voice trembling at first but gaining strength as he continued. "I wasn't trying to break the rules. I was writing something important. I would have turned it off right after. I didn't deserve to have it thrown like that." The captain studied him closely. There was something in his gaze that reminded Ethan of his father, a kind of patience, a search for truth beneath the surface. "I understand," Captain Evans said at last. He turned slightly toward Clara. "Ms. Hayes, I appreciate your commitment to safety, but it seems, in this case, the response may have been disproportionate." Clara's cheeks flushed. She straightened her shoulders. "With all due respect, Captain, undermining my authority in front of passengers makes it impossible for me to do my job." Samuel's voice cut in, calm but firm. "No one is undermining authority. We are holding it accountable. Those are not the same thing." The words landed like a gavel. Ethan felt them reverberate in his chest. He saw the captain's expression shift ever so slightly, as though acknowledging the truth in them. After a long pause, Captain Evans spoke. "Here is what we're going to do. Ethan, you'll put your phone away for the remainder of taxi and landing, as regulations require. Miss Hayes, I expect you to treat this passenger with the same respect you demand in return. This matter ends here." "Understood." Ethan nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Clara hesitated, her jaw clenched, but finally muttered, "Understood." "Good," the captain said, his tone final. "Now, let's return to the cabin and enjoy the rest of the flight." As they walked back down the aisle, Ethan felt dozens of eyes following them. Some passengers looked curious, others sympathetic, a few outright supportive. He caught Mrs. Brooks's gaze and saw her give him a reassuring nod. When they sat again, Ethan exhaled shakily. That was. He trailed off, not sure what word fit. Necessary. Samuel finished for him. His face remained calm, but Ethan could see the quiet fire in his eyes. Ethan leaned back, closing his eyes. For the first time since boarding, he felt a sliver of relief. The captain's words hadn't erased what happened, but they had drawn a line, and more importantly, his father's defense had reminded him of something vital. Dignity mattered, even when challenged. Yet, as Clara moved stiffly down the aisle once more, her expression tight, Ethan knew the story wasn't finished. The tension hadn't vanished. It had simply shifted, waiting for the next spark to ignite it. The hours after the confrontation stretched long and heavy, like a taut rope pulled from both ends. Ethan shifted in his seat, opening and closing his cracked phone screen. Though he dared not type, the captain's words had drawn a fragile truce. But it didn't feel solid. It felt like glass, clear, delicate, one wrong move away from shattering. Clara Hayes moved through the cabin with mechanical precision. She poured sodas, handed out pretzels, collected trash. To anyone not watching closely, she looked composed, efficient. But Ethan noticed the way her jaw stayed tight, the way her eyes skipped over row 17 as if avoiding a wound too raw to touch. Samuel Carter, on the other hand, had returned to his book. He read with the same calm he always carried, but Ethan knew better. He knew that behind his father's steady exterior, thoughts turned like gears, deliberate and relentless. That calm wasn't passivity, it was preparation. The plane jolted suddenly, a quick dip that sent a ripple of gasps through the cabin. A baby cried 2 rows ahead. The seatbelt sign dinged overhead, accompanied by the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've hit a pocket of turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your belts until the sign is off. Crew, secure the cabin." The plane trembled again, harder this time. Trays rattled, cups clinked. A nervous laugh came from somewhere in the back, quickly silenced by another drop that made stomachs lurch. Ethan gripped the armrest, knuckles white. He hated turbulence, always had. The way the plane seemed to surrender control to invisible forces unsettled him deeply. Clara, still near the middle of the aisle, braced herself against a seat as she reached to stow a cart. The plane bucked sharply to the left, and in that split second, the cart shifted violently. Clara's eyes widened. She tried to steady it, but the weight pulled her sideways. Her head struck the edge of a seat with a sickening thud before she crumpled to the floor. Gasps filled the cabin. The cart rolled halfway into the aisle before a passenger shoved it back. "Someone call for help," a voice cried out. For a heartbeat. Ethan froze. It was Clara, the woman who had humiliated him, who had tossed his phone, who had summoned him like a criminal to the galley. And yet, seeing her sprawled on the floor, her hand weakly clutching her temple, all that anger twisted into something else. His father was already moving. Samuel unbuckled in a swift motion and crouched beside her, his voice calm and commanding. "Clara, can you hear me?" She groaned faintly, eyes fluttering, blood trickled near her hairline, bright against her pale skin. Samuel looked up. "I need space. Everyone stay seated." "Ethan, hand me my bag from under the seat." Ethan's body snapped into motion, adrenaline wiping away hesitation. He grabbed the black leather bag and slid it forward. His father unzipped it quickly, pulling out gloves, gauze, a small flashlight. The precision in his movements was almost breathtaking, like watching a conductor guide an orchestra. Except this was no performance. This was survival. "Pressure to the wound," Samuel murmured as he pressed gauze against her head. His tone remained calm, but Ethan noticed the way his father's jaw clenched, the faint crease in his brow. Clara winced, her breath shallow. She opened her eyes briefly, disoriented. What happened? "You took a fall during turbulence," Samuel said gently. "Stay still. You're safe. Safe." The word lingered in the air, heavy with irony. Minutes ago, she had been the enforcer, holding authority over him and Ethan. Now, she lay vulnerable, dependent on the very man she had opposed. Passengers craned their necks, whispers rippling down the cabin. "Mrs." Brooks pressed her scarf to her mouth, eyes wide with worry. The young man, 2 rows back, muttered, "That looks bad." Ethan hovered close, heart pounding. "Dad, is she? She'll live," Samuel said firmly. "But she needs monitoring, likely a concussion. We'll keep her stable until landing." Clara's lips parted. Her eyes flicked to Ethan, then back to Samuel. There was confusion there, maybe even shame, but the strength to voice it failed her. Samuel adjusted the gauze, his hands steady. "Ethan, keep her talking. Simple questions. We need her conscious." Ethan blinked. "Me? Yes. You." Samuel said, "Talk to her. She needs focus." Ethan swallowed hard, then shifted closer. "Clara, what's your favorite city?" Her brow furrowed faintly. "What, just answer," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice gentle. She breathed shakily. "Boston. I grew up there. Okay." Ethan nodded. "What's your favorite food?" Clara gave the faintest ghost of a smile, though her voice was weak. "Lobster rolls?" Ethan kept asking questions, small, ordinary ones. "Favorite season? Favorite movie?" He clung to the rhythm, as if each answer anchored her more firmly in the moment. Slowly, the bitterness he had carried toward her softened, replaced by something unexpected: empathy. The turbulence eased gradually, the plane finding smoother air, the cabin quieted. passengers settling back with nervous relief. But all eyes still flicked toward the scene in the aisle, where the boy, once humiliated, now leaned close to the flight attendant who had wronged him, holding her focus with gentle persistence. After what felt like hours, but was only minutes, Captain Evans' voice returned on the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making an unscheduled stop in Denver for a medical emergency. Please remain calm and seated until further notice." Ethan's stomach flipped. Medical emergency for Clara. The woman who had dragged him to the edge of shame now became the center of compassion. As Samuel checked her pulse again, Clara whispered, almost too faintly to hear, Why are you helping me?" Samuel's eyes softened, though his hands never stopped working. "Because you're human. Because dignity doesn't disappear when you fall. We all deserve it." Ethan felt the words sink deep, heavier than anything he'd read in a textbook or written in his notes. It wasn't just about standing against injustice. It was about rising above anger, even when wronged. Clara's lips trembled. She closed her eyes, but this time not from pain. Something in her had shifted. Ethan could feel it, though he didn't fully understand it yet. The descent toward Denver began, the seatbelt sign chiming once more. Samuel remained crouched, steady as a rock, while Ethan held the gauze in place under his father's guidance. Together, they waited, their roles reversed from earlier in the flight. The boy, who had been treated as small, now held responsibility. The flight attendant, who had wielded power, now relied on his care. It was a moment Ethan knew he would never forget. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane began its descent. A ripple of unease traveled down the rows. The usual quiet before landing replaced by whispers and shifting bodies. Passengers glanced toward the front where Clara lay propped against the galley wall. Samuel crouched beside her with calm precision. Ethan pressed close, hands still steadying the gauze. The captain's voice broke through the murmurs. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for an emergency landing in Denver. Paramedics will meet us at the gate. Please remain seated, belts fastened, and let the crew do their work." Ethan felt his stomach churn, not from the descent, but from the heaviness of what had unfolded. Just hours ago, Clara had seemed untouchable, unyielding in her authority, her voice sharp, her actions decisive. Now she leaned on them, literally fragile as glass. He kept his voice low, almost whispering, "You'll be okay. Clara, we're almost there." Her eyes flickered open, unfocused at first. For the first time, she didn't look at him with disdain. There was something else there, uncertainty, maybe even gratitude, but shadowed with shame. She swallowed and whispered, "I didn't mean to." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to ask what she meant, but his father gave a small shake of his head. Not now. She needed calm, not confession. The wheels of the plane shuddered against turbulence again, jostling passengers in their seats. Gasps broke out as the fuselage rattled. Ethan tightened his grip on the gauze, feeling Clara flinch beneath his hand. "Focus on me," Samuel said gently. "Breathe slow. Clara, in through your nose, out through your mouth." She obeyed, shallow but steady. Her lips trembled. "Why are you helping me?" Samuel met her gaze without hesitation. "Because that's what we do. We help, even when it's not deserved. Especially then." Ethan felt the words strike him as much as they struck her. He wondered if he could have said the same. Would he have helped her if his father hadn't led the way? The question gnawed at him, uncomfortable and raw, The plane dipped again. The skyline of Denver faint through the haze of evening. The Rockies stretched far in the distance, majestic and indifferent. To Ethan, they seemed to echo what his father had said, towering, steady, unmoved by conflict. A flight attendant, younger and clearly rattled, crouched beside Samuel. "Do you need anything, sir? Just space." Samuel answered calmly. "We'll need paramedics immediately." The attendant nodded and hurried back, her eyes wide with a mixture of respect and awe. The passengers were watching too. Whispers carried down the cabin. Ethan caught fragments. Dr. Carter, that boy helping. She was so harsh with him earlier. Mrs. Brooks leaned into the aisle, her voice carrying more firmly than before. "Sometimes it takes falling to the floor to see who will pick you up." The words landed in the hush of the cabin, and no one disagreed. As the city lights of Denver glittered closer, Ethan's thoughts twisted inward. A war raged quietly in him. Part of him felt vindicated, almost satisfied that Clara's own actions had been humbled by circumstance. But another part, the part his father had nurtured, felt something deeper. Compassion, uncomfortable but undeniable. He thought of his mother. She had always told him, "Resentment is easy, Ethan. Compassion is work." He heard her voice as if she were beside him now, and suddenly his eyes stung. He blinked quickly, not wanting anyone to notice. The descent steepened, engines roaring louder. Samuel held Clara steady with one hand while bracing himself with the other. Ethan felt sweat bead at the back of his neck. Each bump, each rattle felt like a warning that life was fragile, unpredictable. The captain's voice came again. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The attendants strapped themselves into jump seats. The passengers stiffened. The air grew thick with anticipation. Ethan swallowed hard and leaned closer to Clara. Almost there. Just a few more minutes. Her lips parted. Her voice was faint but clearer than before. "I treated you badly." Ethan froze. His father's eyes flicked briefly toward him, then back to Clara, silently urging him to respond. He took a breath. His voice wavered but held. "Yeah, you did. But right now, that doesn't matter. What matters is you getting through this." Her eyes filled with something Ethan couldn't name regret, maybe even a plea. She shut them again, silent. The plane jolted as the wheels struck the runway. A collective gasp filled the cabin, followed by a chorus of relief as the engines roared, slowing them down. Ethan's chest heaved as though he had been holding his breath for miles. The aircraft rolled to a halt, paramedic vehicles already waiting outside. The seatbelt sign blinked off, but passengers stayed seated, sensing the urgency. The doors opened, cool night air rushing in, carrying with it the sound of sirens. Paramedics entered quickly, uniforms crisp, voices efficient. Samuel briefed them succinctly, his tone professional. Ethan stepped back, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment collapse onto him. His hands trembled as he released the gauze, streaked with blood. One of the paramedics glanced at him. "You did good, kid." Ethan blinked, startled by the praise. "I just did what he told me." He nodded toward his father, but Samuel's eyes lingered on him, filled with pride. "No, Ethan, you did more than that. You chose to care." The paramedics lifted Clara gently onto a stretcher. She looked pale, fragile, but conscious. As they wheeled her toward the exit, her gaze caught Ethan's. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to still. No words passed, but something unspoken hung there, a fragile thread between regret and gratitude. As she disappeared down the aisle, the cabin exhaled as one. Passengers shifted, murmuring, some even clapping softly in appreciation of Samuel's intervention. But Ethan barely heard it. He sat back in his seat, his mind spinning. The boy who had been humiliated now stood at the center of a story bigger than himself. And though the plane had landed, Ethan sensed his journey was only beginning. The jet bridge groaned as it connected to the cabin. Cold Denver air swept in, carrying the faint scent of jet fuel and rain. Passengers shifted restlessly, their voices buzzing low as the paramedics wheeled Clara Hayes away. Some craned their necks to watch. Others whispered fragments of judgment and speculation. Ethan Carter sat rigid in his seat, his hands still trembling from the weight of what he had held together. The blood on his fingers had dried to a faint crust, a reminder that none of this was imagined, none of it exaggerated. It was all too real. His father, Samuel, sat beside him, silent but composed. That composure was a fortress, but Ethan knew it hid a storm. He could see it in the set of his father's jaw, the way his eyes followed the paramedics until Clara vanished into the airport corridor. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your patience as we disembark row by row. Please remain seated until instructed." But before any passengers could rise, two uniformed airline officials stepped onto the plane, followed by a man in a dark suit whose badge caught the light. His presence carried authority, sharp and official. "Dr. Carter." "Ethan Carter," the man said. His voice clipped. "I'll need you both to step off the plane with us immediately." A murmur swept the cabin. "Mrs. Brooks gasped audibly. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." Ethan's stomach dropped. He turned to his father, panic flickering in his eyes. "Dad, what's happening?" Samuel rose slowly, steady as stone. "We'll find out." He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, guiding him down the aisle. The stares of passengers burned against Ethan's back, sympathy mixed with suspicion, and he felt both as daggers. The officials led them into a sterile holding area near the gate. Bright fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The man in the suit introduced himself curtly. "I'm Mark Phillips, airline security." His gaze was fixed, clinical. "We've received a report of non-compliance and disruption involving your son. We need to ask questions." Ethan's chest tightened. Non-compliance, disruption. Words that twisted reality, stripping away context. He opened his mouth, but Samuel's gentle squeeze on his arm silenced him. Samuel spoke instead. "We'll answer questions. But first, I want clarity. Is this inquiry about safety or about preserving the image of your employee Mark's eyes narrowed? It's about ensuring order." A flight attendant reported aggressive resistance. Ethan felt heat rush to his face. "That's not true." His voice cracked, louder than he intended. "I wasn't aggressive. She grabbed my phone. Ethan." Samuel interrupted softly, his voice both anchor and caution. He looked at Mark. My son remained calm. Several passengers witnessed the incident. "I suggest you gather their accounts before assigning blame." Mark's jaw ticked. "We will. For now, you'll remain here." The words fell heavy. Ethan clenched his fists, torn between fear and fury. His father, however, remained motionless, breathing slow. That patience wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Ethan could see it now. Moments later, a soft voice broke the tension. Mrs. Brooks appeared, escorted by a younger airline staffer. Her white hair was slightly disheveled from the long flight, but her eyes burned with clarity. "I'll speak," she said firmly, surprising everyone with her resolve. "I saw everything. That boy was polite, respectful. It was the flight attendant who lost control." Mark's expression faltered. "Ma'am, we'll take your statement separately." "No," she cut him off. "You'll hear it now, while this boy is being treated like a criminal." Ethan's chest swelled. For the first time since stepping into the holding room, he felt less alone. Other passengers trickled in too. 2 college students, a middle-aged man in a baseball cap, even the young mother with the crying baby. Their voices overlapped, a chorus of accounts painting the same picture. Ethan had been calm. Clara had crossed a line. Mark scribbled notes, his composure slipping under the weight of testimony. At last, he exhaled sharply. "We'll review this thoroughly. For now, you're free to go. Free to go." The words should have felt like release, but they rang hollow. Ethan's heart still pounded, his breath uneven. He looked at his father, waiting for some assurance that justice had actually been done. Samuel turned to Mark, his voice measured but cutting. "You tried to turn an injured woman's poor judgment into my son's fault. Do better, because next time there may not be witnesses brave enough to speak." Mark's face reddened, but he said nothing. As Samuel guided Ethan out into the bustling terminal, the weight of the encounter settled between them. The Denver airport was alive with movement, families rushing with luggage, announcements echoing overhead, the smell of coffee drifting from kiosks. Life continued, indifferent to what had just unraveled. Ethan walked silently, his mind spinning. Anger flared at the injustice of it all, but beneath it, something else lingered, the memory of Clara's face, pale and vulnerable, whispering that she hadn't meant to. "Dad," Ethan said quietly, "what if she really didn't mean to? What if she was just broken in her own way?" Samuel looked at him, his eyes softening. "Intent matters, but impact matters more. What she did hurt you. What you did saved her. That's the truth you carry forward." Ethan swallowed hard, the words carving deep into him. He wanted to believe them, to hold on to them like a shield against the bitterness clawing at his chest. They sat near a window while waiting for instructions about their connecting flight. Outside, the Rockies loomed dark against the fading sky, their peaks dusted with snow. Ethan stared at them, silent. "Do you feel angry?" Samuel asked after a long pause. "Yes," Ethan admitted, "and confused. I hated her for what she did, but then I helped her. And now I don't even know how I'm supposed to feel." Samuel nodded slowly. "That's the struggle of compassion. It doesn't erase the wrong. It doesn't excuse it, but it frees you from carrying its poison." Ethan leaned back, the words circling his mind. Compassion didn't excuse. It freed. He repeated it silently, as if trying to etch it into his bones. A movement caught his eye. Through the window, he saw paramedics wheeling Clara across the tarmac into an ambulance. For a fleeting moment, her head turned, eyes searching. Their gazes met through the glass. She didn't smile, didn't wave. But there was something there, an acknowledgement, fragile yet undeniable. Ethan exhaled slowly. Whatever war had begun in the cabin wasn't over, but its battlefield had shifted. It was no longer about authority versus resistance. It was about the human cost of judgment, and the fragile bridges built when compassion enters the fight. The announcement came overhead. Their rescheduled flight to Baltimore would depart in 2 hours. Samuel gathered their things, placing a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Come on, son," he said quietly. "Our journey isn't finished yet." Ethan rose, his chest heavy, but his steps steady. The night air outside the terminal pressed against the glass, cool and unyielding, and somewhere in the distance a siren faded into silence. The story of Flight 2187 wasn't ending in Denver, it was only transforming. The terminal had begun to empty, the energy of the day thinning into the heavy quiet of night. Most of the shops had their metal shutters pulled down, leaving only a few coffee kiosks open, their machines hissing and steaming in the distance. The Carter men sat near Gate C-27, their carry-ons at their feet, a window stretching beside them to reveal the wide tarmac bathed in floodlights. Ethan leaned against the armrest, his hoodie pulled tight, his thoughts louder than the announcements echoing through the terminal. The adrenaline from the confrontation had drained away, leaving him hollow, restless, almost shaky. He rubbed his palms together, feeling the roughness of dried blood where he'd pressed gauze to Clara's head. His father sat upright, posture unbent despite the exhaustion settling into his shoulders. Samuel had that quiet presence that seemed untouchable, as though the storm that rattled everyone else always broke against his calm without leaving a trace. But Ethan, who had studied his father's face his whole life, noticed the faint crease at his brow, the way his fingers lingered too long around his coffee cup. Even strength, Ethan realized, carried its own weight. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the muffled hum of late-night travelers. A family passed with sleepy children in pajamas, dragging small suitcases. A businessman spoke rapidly into his phone, voice clipped with frustration. Life moved around them, but for Ethan, it felt like they existed in a bubble of stillness, pressed against the glass of the night. Finally, Samuel broke the quiet. "You've been awfully quiet, son." Ethan shrugged, staring at the tarmac. "I'm just trying to figure it all out." "Figure what out?" Ethan turned slightly, his voice low. "How I'm supposed to feel. About her. About all of it. I mean, she treated me like I didn't matter. Dad, like I was just trouble. And then suddenly, I'm the one holding her life together. It doesn't make sense." Samuel studied him, his expression softening. "It makes perfect sense, actually. You were faced with a choice. You could have turned away, let bitterness decide for you, but you didn't. You chose to see her humanity, even when she didn't see yours." Ethan exhaled sharply, frustration tightening his chest. "But why should I have to? Why is it always on us to be the bigger person? Why do we always have to prove our worth? Even when we're the ones being wronged," his father didn't answer right away. He leaned back, his gaze drifting to the window where planes blinked faintly in the distance. "I won't pretend it's fair," Samuel said finally. "It isn't, and it shouldn't be. But son, every time we choose compassion over resentment, we take back power they tried to strip away. We remind them and ourselves that they can't define us." Ethan swallowed hard. The words cut deep, but they didn't erase the sting in his chest. It just feels heavy. "Dad, like I'm carrying something I didn't ask for." Samuel's eyes softened further. "You are, and I wish I could take it from you. But here's the thing, weight can break you, or it can build muscle. The choice is yours." Ethan leaned forward, pressing his hands into his hair. His mind spun back to his mother. Her laugh, warm and unshakable. The way she always hummed when she cooked. The way she used to tell him stories about endurance, about not letting bitterness calcify into his bones. She would have said the same thing his father had just said, but she wasn't here anymore, and somehow that made it both harder and clearer. He whispered, almost to himself, "Mom would have told me the same thing." Samuel's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady. "She would have, and she would have been proud of what you did today." That broke something loose in Ethan. He blinked rapidly, his throat tightening. He didn't want to cry in the middle of an airport, but the weight of it all, the humiliation, the anger, the compassion he hadn't expected to feel, crashed into him like a wave. His father didn't press, didn't try to stop it. He just rested a hand on Ethan's back, solid and steady, the same way he had when Ethan was a boy terrified of storms. They sat like that for a long while, the silence no longer empty but full, carrying the unspoken bond of father and son navigating a world that too often demanded more of them than it gave back. Eventually, Samuel stood. "Come on, let's walk a little." They wandered the quiet terminal, their footsteps echoing softly. The shops were closed, the gates mostly empty. The world outside the windows was still. Planes parked like sleeping giants under the floodlights. As they walked, Ethan noticed something. People glanced at them not with suspicion this time, but with recognition. Some of the passengers from their flight nodded subtly, small acknowledgments of what had happened. A young man even whispered, "Respect, man," as they passed. It made Ethan's chest tighten again, but differently this time. Not with shame, but with the strange weight of visibility. For once, they weren't invisible. People had seen the truth. They reached a quieter corner where only a few cleaning crews worked. Samuel sat again, motioning for Ethan to do the same. "You know," Samuel said, his tone almost reflective, "compassion isn't just for the other person. It's for you, too. Carrying anger is like drinking poison and waiting for someone else to die. You don't forgive because they deserve it. You forgive because you do." Ethan let the words sink in. He didn't know if he was ready to forgive Clara yet. Maybe he wouldn't be for a long time, but he understood. At least, that compassion wasn't about letting her off the hook. It was about freeing himself from the chain of her actions. For the first time since they landed, Ethan felt his chest loosen slightly. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. The hours dragged, but eventually their boarding call came. As they gathered their bags, Ethan glanced one last time toward the window where Denver's lights flickered in the distance. He thought of Clara in some hospital bed, thought of the look in her eyes when she asked why he had helped her. He didn't have an answer yet. Maybe he never fully would, but he knew this much: the night in Denver had carved something permanent into him. He wasn't just a boy trying to keep up with the world anymore. He was someone who had stood in the storm, who had chosen a path even when the ground beneath him shook. As they walked toward their new gate, Samuel placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "The night's been long," he said quietly, "but it's not the end of the story. Remember that." Ethan nodded slowly, his steps matching his father's. Somewhere, deep inside, despite the exhaustion, a spark had lit. He didn't know where it would lead, but he knew his story was still being written. Baltimore's dawn filtered through tall glass windows, pale and uncertain, painting the terminal in muted gold, the Carters, weary from a sleepless night and the chaos of their diverted journey, finally stepped off their connecting flight. Their bodies were tired, but the weight pressing on their hearts was heavier still. Ethan's shoulders sagged under his backpack, eyes ringed with shadows from exhaustion, yet inside, a storm brewed. The injustice of it all refused to fade. Clara Hayes's scorn, the humiliation of being cornered in front of strangers, the sting of airline security painting him as a threat, all of it clung to him like smoke. Samuel walked beside him, calm but firm, as though carrying his own invisible load. Ethan had come to recognize that silence wasn't emptiness in his father, it was strategy, calculation, the patient gathering of strength before a decisive move. And that morning, he sensed something building in him, at baggage claim, while others wrestled suitcases off the carousel. Samuel pulled out his phone. His fingers moved quickly, typing, sending. Ethan tilted his head, curiosity stirring. "What are you doing?" "Dad, contacting the airline." Samuel replied, his tone low but steady. "They need to hear from us. Not later, not when it's easy for them to bury the truth. Today." Ethan felt a jolt of unease. "You mean like a complaint?" Samuel's eyes met his, sharp with resolve. "Not just a complaint, a record, an insistence that what happened to you doesn't get rewritten in their favor." For a moment, Ethan hesitated. A part of him wanted to move on, to leave it behind in Denver, bury it beneath exhaustion and silence. But another part, the louder part, burned for recognition, for accountability. He gave a small nod. Okay. Within an hour, they were seated in a quiet office near the airline's customer relations center. The walls were sterile, decorated only with bland posters of smiling families boarding planes. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. A woman entered, her blazer pressed, her smile professional but cautious. "Dr. Carter, Ethan. I'm Karen Miller, Regional Customer Liaison. I understand there were issues on your flight." "Issues," Samuel repeated, his tone razor thin. "That's a delicate word for what happened." Karen's smile faltered. "We want to listen. Please, tell us your perspective." Samuel glanced at Ethan. This is his story. He'll tell it. Ethan stiffened under the sudden weight of expectation. His throat tightened. The room felt too bright. The woman's pen poised above her notebook like a trap. But then he caught his father's gaze, steady, encouraging. This wasn't just about recounting events, it was about reclaiming his voice. So he spoke, slowly at first, halting, then stronger, steadier. He described how Clara had demanded his phone, how he'd asked for a moment, how she'd snatched it and dropped it. He explained the humiliation of being treated like a threat, the sting of being misjudged before the entire cabin. His voice cracked when he recalled how security had pulled them aside, branding him disruptive. Karen scribbled notes, her brow furrowed. When he finished, silence hung heavy. Ethan's chest rose and fell, his heart hammering. Samuel leaned forward. "And let's be clear, my son did nothing wrong. He complied. He was calm. Witnesses backed him up. The failure here was not his. It was in how your employee weaponized authority and how your system defaulted to suspicion rather than truth." Karen swallowed. "Dr. Carter, I assure you, we take these matters very seriously." Samuel's voice sharpened. Because history suggests otherwise. Incidents like this don't vanish in isolation. They're part of a pattern. A pattern where young men who look like my son are treated as problems before they're treated as people." The room fell silent again. Ethan stared at his hands, both trembling and strong at once. He felt seen, truly seen, as his father spoke. Karen shifted uncomfortably. "We'll conduct a full review. Statements will be taken from passengers and disciplinary action may be considered. But I must stress, these processes take time." Samuel straightened, his voice calm but ironclad. "Time isn't the issue. Accountability is. And whether you address this publicly or not, we will not allow the truth to be silenced." Ethan saw something flicker in Karen's eyes, defensiveness mixed with unease. But she nodded, her pen trembling slightly as she wrote. When the meeting ended, they stepped back into the terminal, the noise of travelers filling the air again. Ethan felt drained, but also lighter. Speaking had lifted something from him, even if the outcome remained uncertain. They found a quiet cafe near the exit. Samuel sipped black coffee, his eyes distant. Ethan stirred his hot chocolate absent-mindedly, his reflection swirling in the cup. "Dad," he said softly, "what if they don't do anything? What if it just disappears into paperwork?" Samuel looked at him, his gaze steady. "Then we keep telling the story, to anyone who will listen, because silence is what allows injustice to keep repeating itself. You spoke today, Ethan. That matters more than you realize." Ethan nodded, though doubt still lingered. But beneath it was something else, pride. Not pride in the confrontation itself, but in the fact that he hadn't let his voice be stolen. They sat in quiet for a while, watching people hurry past with suitcases and coffees, their lives rushing forward. The Carters, though exhausted, had found something stronger than sleep. They had found resolve. Ethan leaned back, letting his eyes close briefly. He could still see Clara's face, pale and shaken, whispering that she hadn't meant to. That image clung to him, even now, tangled with everything else. He wasn't sure if forgiveness would ever come, but he was sure this silence would not. And for the first time since boarding Flight 2187, that truth felt like a kind of victory. 2 days later, the world no longer felt quite as still. The storm that had brewed inside the cabin of Flight 2187 was spilling outward, rippling beyond the walls of the aircraft and the sterile office where Ethan and his father had spoken. It began quietly. A post appeared online, written by one of the passengers, a college student with glasses and a notebook who had been seated across the aisle from Ethan. Her words were plain but powerful. "I saw what happened on Flight 2187. A kid treated unfairly, calm, while an adult lost control. The truth needs to be told." The post gained traction. First a handful of comments, then hundreds. Photos surfaced, grainy shots snapped by phones, capturing fragments of the confrontation, Ethan's expression tight with restraint. Clara looming over him, Samuel rising from his seat with quiet authority. The images told a story even before words did. By the third day, local news stations picked it up. Flight incident raises questions about bias in the skies. One headline read, "Ethan sat in the living room, staring at the TV as a reporter recounted the events with a solemn voice." He saw his own face on the screen, blurred slightly for privacy, but unmistakably his stomach tightened. "Dad, I didn't ask for this. I don't want to be on the news." Samuel, seated beside him, folded his hands calmly. "You didn't ask, but sometimes the story finds you. The question is, what will you do with it?" Ethan looked back at the screen. Part of him wanted to disappear, to shrink from the sudden exposure. But another part, the part that had spoken in that office, the part that had held steady even when his heart shook, knew retreat wasn't an option. Later that afternoon, his phone buzzed with messages, friends from school, strangers online, even teachers. Some offered support. Some shared their own stories of being treated unfairly. One message stood out, though it was from Mrs. Brooks, the elderly woman who had stood up for him. Her text read, "Proud of you, young man. You stayed calm when others would have broken. Don't let the noise shake you. The truth is with you." Ethan smiled faintly, clutching the phone. Her words were like a thread tying him back to that cabin, to the moment he'd felt the most alone until she'd spoken up. But the ripple wasn't all positive. Soon, comments surfaced, questioning his version of events. Maybe he overreacted. We don't know what happened before the video. Flight attendants have a tough job. Maybe he was being difficult. Ethan scrolled through them, his chest tightening with each one. Doubt crept in, sharp and insidious. He tossed the phone aside, burying his face in his hands. "I can't do this," he muttered. "I can't handle everyone twisting it." Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Ethan, the louder the truth becomes, the louder the lies will try to drown it. That's the nature of the fight. You don't battle for their approval, you stand for what you know is right." Ethan exhaled shakily, nodding, though the knot in his chest remained. That evening, the doorbell rang. A young journalist stood there, holding a recorder and a notebook. Her voice was gentle but determined. "Mr. Carter, Ethan, I'd like to give you a chance to share your story. Your words, not anyone else's." Samuel studied her for a moment, then looked at Ethan. "This is your decision, son." Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding. Speaking meant stepping fully into the light, letting strangers peer into the most vulnerable chapter of his life. But silence would mean letting others own his story. "I'll talk," he said finally. His voice trembled, but he didn't back down. They sat at the kitchen table. The journalist asked careful questions, and Ethan answered with honesty. He spoke not only about Clara, but about how it felt, the humiliation, the anger, the compassion that had surprised him. He spoke of his mother, of her lessons about dignity, of the emptiness her absence left. He spoke of his father, a steady anchor when the storm raged. When the interview ended, the journalist closed her notebook softly. "Thank you. People need to hear this." The article went live the next day. Its headline read, "Teen Speaks Out After Flight Incident. I Just Wanted to Be Treated Like a Person." The effect was immediate. Messages poured in, not just of support, but of solidarity. Stories from across the country, people who had faced similar treatment, who had been silenced or dismissed. Ethan read them with a mixture of awe and sorrow. He realized his story wasn't just his, it was part of something larger, a web of voices too often ignored. But there was another ripple Ethan hadn't expected. A letter arrived, hand-delivered by courier. Inside was a short note written in neat handwriting. "Ethan, I don't expect forgiveness. I only want to say I'm sorry. That day, I failed you. I failed myself. I'm in the hospital recovering, but I'll be facing the consequences of my actions in more ways than one. I hope you find peace, even if it never includes me. Clara Hayes." Ethan stared at the note for a long time. His emotions tangled. Anger still lived in him, sharp and raw. But so did something else, a flicker of recognition that even those who wound us carry their own fractures. He handed the note to his father. Samuel read it silently, then handed it back. "What do you feel?" he asked. Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. Part of me wants to tear it up. Part of me feels sorry for her. Samuel's voice was quiet. Both can be true. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, sleep evaded him. His mind churned with the weight of the ripple he had set in motion. His life was no longer the same. The world had seen him, judged him, supported him, questioned him, and through it all he had stood not perfectly, not without fear, but he had stood. Staring at the ceiling, he whispered to the darkness, "I just wanted to be treated like a person." The words echoed back, both fragile and powerful, and for the first time, he believed that maybe his voice could help change more than just his own story. Maybe it could shift the current for others, too. The morning light over Baltimore was crisp, painting the city in a soft golden haze. Ethan Carter stood at his bedroom window, staring out at the quiet street lined with sycamore trees. The past week had felt like a lifetime, an unexpected storm that had pulled him from the anonymity of an ordinary teenager into the glare of public attention. He still carried the echoes of Flight 2187, Clara Hayes's raised voice, the drop of his phone onto the floor, the humiliation of suspicion wrapping around him like chains. And yet, when he thought of the journey as a whole, the moments that rose strongest weren't just those of pain. They were the moments when voices rose for him, when his father stood tall, when Mrs. Brooks spoke truth, when strangers sent messages saying, "I've been there too." That morning, as he dressed for school, Ethan felt different. Not older exactly, but steadier, as if something inside him had been forged in fire and had come out harder, clearer. Downstairs, Samuel Carter was at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, papers spread before him. He looked up as Ethan entered, ready for today. Ethan nodded, sliding into the chair opposite him, "As ready as I'll ever be." Samuel studied him, then smiled faintly. "I'm proud of you, son. Not because the world saw you, but because you stood in the truth even when it was hard." Ethan lowered his gaze, his throat tightening. "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without you." Samuel reached across the table, placing a hand over his son's. "You'll discover one day you've got more of your mother in you than you realize. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just refusing to bow when the world tells you to shrink." Ethan swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in his eyes. His mother's absence was a wound that never closed. But somehow, through all of this, he felt closer to her, as if her lessons had been waiting inside him all along, just needing a storm to bring them out. Later that afternoon, Samuel received a call. The airline had completed its initial review. Clara Hayes had been suspended pending further investigation, and the company planned to issue a public statement addressing the incident. When Samuel hung up, he relayed the news to Ethan. The boy sat in silence for a moment, processing. "So, that's it. She's suspended for now," Samuel said. "There'll be more. But this isn't about punishment. It's about recognition. The system admitted it failed you. That matters." Ethan nodded slowly, but unease lingered. "I don't want her life destroyed. Dad, I just wanted to be treated like a person." Samuel leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "And that, Ethan, is exactly why you're stronger than she ever gave you credit for." Word spread quickly. News outlets covered the airline's statement. Noting Ethan's calm demeanor and Samuel's measured advocacy, social media was ablaze with debate. Some praised the Carters for their restraint and dignity. Others argued the airline's response was insufficient. Ethan tried not to drown in the noise. He focused on school, on basketball practice, on the familiar rhythm of normal life. Yet even there, the ripple followed him. Classmates stopped him in hallways. Teachers spoke words of quiet encouragement. He was no longer invisible. One Friday evening, after dinner, Ethan and his father walked through the neighborhood. The air was cool, filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint hum of cicadas. They walked in silence for a while, their steps falling into rhythm. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Do you think things will really change, Dad? Or will it just be another story people forget?" Samuel's eyes softened. "Change doesn't come all at once, son. It comes in ripples. One voice, one story, one truth at a time. You've added yours to the current. That's how rivers carve canyons, not overnight, but over time, with persistence." Ethan let the words sink in. He thought of Clara's letter, of her apology. He hadn't responded, and maybe he never would. But her words had shown him something he hadn't expected, that even those who hurt others carried their own storms. "I don't know if I forgive her," Ethan admitted, "but I don't hate her either. I just feel sorry." "Is that weird?" Samuel shook his head. "It's human. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing. It's about releasing yourself from carrying their weight. You're allowed to feel both sorrow and strength." They stopped at a small park bench, sitting under a lamppost that glowed faintly in the evening. Ethan tilted his head back, staring at the stars pricked against the navy sky. For the first time since that flight, he felt something close to peace. Not because the pain was gone, but because he'd learned it didn't define him. He was more than what had been done to him. As the weeks turned to months, the story faded from headlines, as all stories eventually do, but for Ethan, it never disappeared. It became part of him, an anchor, a reminder of who he was when tested. He didn't seek the spotlight, but when people asked, he told the truth, calmly, steadily, without bitterness. Years later, when he looked back, he wouldn't remember every detail of Flight 2187, but he would remember the lesson it had carved into him, that dignity isn't granted by others. It's claimed within. That compassion can coexist with anger. That justice is not always loud, but it is always worth pursuing. And above all, he would remember the words he had whispered to the darkness that long night in Denver. "I just wanted to be treated like a person." It was simple, it was human, and it was powerful enough to ripple outward, far beyond him. Ethan Carter had entered the flight as a boy weighed down by grief and invisibility. He left it as something more, not a symbol, not a headline, but a young man who had stood firm in his truth. And that, in the end, was the victory no one could take away. Sometimes the loudest battles aren't fought on battlefields, but in quiet moments when dignity is questioned, when silence feels safer than speaking. Ethan Carter's story reminds us that strength isn't just about anger. It's about calm courage, about standing steady in the storm while the world watches. The injustice he faced on Flight 2187 is not just his story. It's a mirror, reflecting the bias and prejudice that still seep into everyday life. But it's also a call that each of us, when confronted with wrong, can choose to be like his father, or like the passenger who spoke up a witness unwilling to stay silent. Let this story stay with you. Let it remind you to value compassion over judgment, justice over comfort, and humanity above all else. If Ethan could find his voice in the face of humiliation, then perhaps we too can find ours when it matters most. Thank you for journeying with us. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we'll continue bringing stories that stir the heart, spark reflection, and shine light on truths that must be heard.